This is GARIS, Masculist-MGTOW Flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 366, entitled A Masculist-MGTOW Retries E-Dating. Description. This flyer relates my experiences in retrying the e-dating scene and extracts some lessons to be learned, mainly that if one filters through large numbers of dating candidates and states one's preferences clearly on one's profile, then it's sometimes possible to find the jewel one is looking for. Flyer itself, a bit bigger. A Masculist/MGTOW Retries E-Dating by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer presents my experiences and lessons on retrying the e-dating process. I hope it may be helpful to other masculists and MGTOWs who are thinking of re-entering the dating scene and what to look out for. Nearly 20 years ago, living in the US as a computer science professor, I enrolled in an e-dating site and had a string of such relationships, most of them lasting only a few months before it became clear that the level of basic compatibility was insufficient, so we separated. If I make a mental list of the number of women I have had emotional sexual relationships with over my whole lifetime, half of them were in this US phase of my life, that is 5 years, sandwiched between 8 years in Japan and 12 years in China. This flyer tries to extract lessons from my experiences that might be useful to other masculists/MGTOWs who are thinking about entering or re-entering the e-dating scene, perhaps benefiting from the lessons I learned and what traps should be avoided. Probably the first thing I learned during this US e-dating experience was that one needs to state one's standards clearly on one's profile that potential women dates can read. Since I was living in a rather provincial town in a non-populous state in the US, pickings were slim. So I first thought that I would cast my net rather widely. In fact, I did it too widely. Since I'm a retired professor, my top criterion for a woman to be a suitable date is her high intelligence. Otherwise, I would get quickly bored and cross her off. I quickly learned not to date women who merely had bachelor degrees. So if you have a high IQ, then don't settle for a woman who is noticeably dumber than you. Otherwise, you will quickly lose respect for her and you will find the woman a waste of time. She will then, using women's famous intuition, with her super-sensitive emotional antenna, pick up your indifference and lack of respect for her and will want out of the relationship as well. So, if you live in a much larger metropolis, such as a big city with multiple millions of people, you're in a much better position to choose, to be pickier, to be more demanding. 2 decades later, I now live in Australia, in Melbourne, which has a population of 5 million, as does Sydney, so I can afford to be pickier, laying down rather demanding and explicit prerequisites in the women I would consider to be suitable candidates as dates. Before relating my experiences in Oz, that's slang for Australia, perhaps I should mention something about why I, who has lived the past year as a MGTOW monk, having nothing to do with women, hence no dates, no sex, no socializing with women, decided to retry the e-dating scene. When I first arrived in Oz 2 years ago, after having lived 12 years in China with my third and fourth wives, both Chinese, in brackets, marrying the later 3 largely for visa reasons, close brackets. I was freshly divorced, with no social life at all in a country I had not lived in for half a century. All I had socially was my immediate family, a father who died a few months back at the age of 100, my brother and sister and her husband. So I decided I would try e-dating in Oz, as I had done in the zeros in the US. I did that for 6 months, but had much the same disappointing experiences in Oz as I had in the US 2 decades before, but for different reasons. In the US, I quickly learned that women with bachelor degrees were on average noticeably dumber than women with master's degrees or PhDs. But there weren't many PhD women in my radius of 100 miles by car, so most of the dates I had were with women with master's degrees. But because there were rather thin pickings, each woman was rather a compromise, so the relationship rather quickly ran into problems due to incompatibility, or as I suspect, in brackets here, and this might apply to me too if I'm emotionally honest with myself. Many of these women had filtered themselves, who carried emotional baggage from previous relationships. For example, one of the better relationships I had with one of them, who was very bright, whom I persuaded to start a PhD, inherited her mother's alcoholism problem, so got so drunk she would black out at age 20 until she went to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, to dry herself out. Her mother suffered so badly from alcoholism that she suicided when her daughter was 10, traumatizing her with fears of abandonment. So when I increasingly complained about the religiosity and lack of sophistication of Utah people, in brackets, the bloody Mormons, living in a flyover state, she began to have abandonment fears about me, sensing that I would eventually flee from the US to go somewhere old worldly and a lot more sophisticated, which I eventually did, heading off to China to have the adventure of living in a culturally rich and stimulating environment. Eventually, after a string of half-baked relationships, I managed to find a PhD woman who was genuinely nice and grateful to have her own man after being alone for many years, whom I saw weekends. But when the time came for me to leave for China, she wanted to come with me. But having had the experience that women are much more context dependent for their social well-being, I thought that it would be a bad idea to pull a monocultured American woman out of the US to a third world dictatorial shithole, whose language she did not speak, so that she would only wither emotionally and culturally and pull me down. I preferred to start up a new relationship with a Chinese woman, which I did fairly easily, since as a Western professor I had high status in China. I started up a relationship with the daughter of a general who was on the Long March with Mao, who told me that it was taboo in China to just live together, so I agreed to marry her. She told me that she wanted to start a PhD, but she never did. As time passed, I began to see she had seriously oversold herself. My respect for her lowered, so we parted. For my next relationship, I was a lot more particular about the woman I chose. She was a university professor on ancient Chinese literature, who initially was fun to be with. I wanted to stay in China, and she was quite willing to marry, so I then benefited from a spousal visa, thanks to her, hence another visa-based marriage. But after a few years, the sex dried up. She began nagging to the point that I suspect she had a borderline personality disorder, BPD, as though her brain was not properly wired. So after 8 years, that marriage ended. My second wife was Belgian, whom I married when I finished my PhD in Brussels and was about to head off to Japan for a postdoc. So I married her so that she could come with me to Japan as a wife. She smoked heavily when she was young and died of lung cancer at the early age of 63. So I've had 3 divorces and was widowed once. After all these marriages, I feel I've had my fingers burned enough times that I've wiped my hands of marriage. I see the institution of marriage dying all around me. Young people tend to marry now less and less. Part of the reason young men don't marry is that the fluffy feminists have taken over the divorce courts and made divorce so toxic for men that young men advise each other not to marry, not to have kids, because if they do, they will face a 1 in 4 chance of being financially massacred, having their kids ripped away from them, forced to pay alimony, lose their house, half their stuff, etc. A really shitty deal for men. So, after 6 months of e-dating in Oz, starting 2 years ago, with the firm intention of never marrying again, I had a hard time finding compatible women to date. My brother warned me that the PhD'd women that I would prefer would nearly all be, as he termed it, feminazi bitches, and he was largely right. I found several times that once a relationship looked to be getting off the ground, when I started talking about masculist ideas, the women took offence and hacked off. This pissed me off no end with its hypocrisy, with its attitude of, it's okay for women to lash out at men for the way that men oppress women, but it's not okay for men to lash out at women for the way that women oppress men. Oz women are almost totally monoconscious. That is, they are angry at men for the way men oppress women, but know nothing about masculism and how women oppress men. They have not had both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, so are, by definition, not bi-conscious. Monoconscious feminists tend to be feminazi bigots, whereas bi-conscious feminists tend to be much nicer to men, since they understand that gender oppression is a two-way street, in that women can oppress men too. I felt I had to tell these women about my masculist ideas, otherwise the time and effort I put into the building of the relationship would be wasted if they would then quickly hack off once learning about my masculist views. In that first 6-month attempt starting 2 years ago, I only had one face-to-face relationship with a Russian woman, but she turned out to have such a princess snowflake mentality, so out to control a man, that relationship quickly died. For example, she would complain that when crossing a road that I did not take care that she had crossed safely, or that I did not wait with her for her tram to arrive before I headed home. Maybe that's the way Russian man-slaved men behave, but I found it infantile on her part and very off-putting, so she got dumped. After all my US and now this 6-month e-dating failure in Oz, I was a bit burned out e-dating, so I decided to live the lifestyle of the MGTOW monk for an indefinite period, dateless, womanless, sexless, but stress-free, problem-free and calm. I lived that for a year, but gradually that lifestyle felt rather joyless, soulless, so eventually decided to give e-dating another chance. Surprisingly, this time, this second attempt was a lot more fruitful. So what did I do this time that made the second attempt so much more rewarding? This is the end of part 1.